Ahoy hoy, I'm Planartalk, and welcome to episode 9 of Planartalk. It's been a while since I've done this. Last one was with Steve McRae, Fight the Flat Earth, and Landon Knoll, and that was about nuclear power. Anyway, we're back with episode 9, and today we're going to be having a discussion with a Paris Agreement negotiator. So, let's get into it. Let me just switch over so that you can see the screen. Alright, so do you want to introduce yourself?
Okay, so I am a negotiator in climate change global negotiations for several years now. I was in Paris in 2015, involved in the negotiation of the Paris Agreement, and actually I've reached out to you after your beautiful collab about the cat lady with Steam Skeptic and AB Science. I've seen these 3 movies. I've seen the claim by the cat lady that there are just 4 people that read the Paris Agreement, not counting those that wrote it. Well, I'm one of the people that work on writing it, so here I am.
Okay, so you said you just had a kind of presentation for us. Well, actually, I'll just let people know the structure of how this is going to go. So you're going to start with your sort of presentation. I've got a few questions about certain things to do with the Paris Agreement. Then I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience, and yeah, we'll go from there.
Yep, exactly that.
Okay.
So, yeah, okay. So, first of all, I would like to start with a bit of history. There was one thing that I found missing in the cat lady's presentation, because that is something that a lot of climate deniers use as an example. In 1980s, as you know, we found the gaps in the ozone layer. And afterwards, in 1987, we had the Montreal Protocol that was designed to keep the depletion of the ozone layer to the minimum and try to recharge the ozone layer eventually. So a lot of climate deniers use this as an example that, well, we had these holes in the ozone layer, but they are healing now, so what's the problem with the climate? And the thing that is about the Montreal Protocol, oh, sorry that it's hardly understandable. I will try to be more clear and speak more slowly. So the Montreal Protocol was designed to replace the gases that were harming the ozone layer with the less harmful ones. They have designed the proper financial mechanism to replace those gases in the developing countries. And since 1991, about $1 billion were spent to phase out the more harmful gases in favor of the less harmful ones. And the process continues with new protocols that are updating the Montreal Protocol.
Okay. So basically, I'll try and sum up what I took from that. So basically, we had this whole hole in the ozone layer, and what's happened is we've gone ahead and tried to fix it with by basically having a convention back then, which would fade out things like the CFCs. Am I correct about that? Okay. Anyway, so what was the next thing that you wanted to bring up?
Okay, so afterwards, in 1992, we had the Rio Earth Summit. There were 3 conventions that were prepared there. So this was the convention to combat desertification. the Convention to keep the biodiversity, and the Climate Convention, United Nations Framework Convention, Climate Change. The Convention on Climate Change had its own financial mechanism, which was actually designed similar to the financial mechanism under the Montreal Protocol, and as well, it has established a fund. It was called Global Environmental Facility, which at the time was for the pre-conventions that were created in Rio. To show the scale of the Global Environmental Facility, for its first replenishment, that was for the years 1994-1998, it was $2 billion. The current replenishment goes from 2018 to 2022. It's $4.1 billion. This, I would also like to show the structure of the convention bodies, because it will be important later. So we have something called Conference of the Parties, or COP, that is meeting once a year, usually it's November or December each year. We have subsidiary bodies, that's subsidiary body on implementation and subsidiary body on scientific and technical advice that meets twice a year. Once it's either May or June, and second time is during the COP. And sometimes we also have some ad hoc working groups that are created to prepare, for example, specific agreements, like it was ADP, ad hoc working group on the Durban program, that was preparing the Paris Agreement. Then, going back to history, first of all, we had the first legally binding protocol established at COP3 in 1997. That was the Kyoto Protocol. It was the first top-down emission limit. It was setting down top-down emission limits for years 2008-2012. Later, there was a second commitment period between 2013 and 2020 that was called the Doha Amendment. However, there was one problem with the Kyoto Protocol at the time, as US did not ratify it. So even before the first Kyoto Protocol period started, in 2007 on COP13 on Bali, the negotiators found a need to create a new legally binding protocol, this time one that will have US on board. And so Bali Action Plan was set up in 2007, and it was to deliver a new legally binding agreement in 2009 in Copenhagen during COP15.
Okay. Yeah. So the US hasn't sounds like the US hasn't generally been on board with all the climate change things, both.
Yeah. Sorry for the bad quality of this of this mic, but I'm trying.
Yeah.
Anyway, the Copenhagen was sort of failure. It did deliver a Copenhagen Accord, but this accord was never global because it was agreed only by 114 parties out of 197 that are under the convention, and it was not legally binding. Anyway, parts of this accord, parts of those accords were included in the decision taken in 2010 in Cancun, and they set up several things like Green Climate Fund, that is now one of the funds under the convention. They set up the 100 billion goal for the climate finance. I will talk about it much later, but this is, oh boy, very interesting topic. And also, a year later, in Durban in 2011, the convention has started a process to achieve a new global and legally binding agreement. It was set up to end up in Paris in 2015 during the COP21. And after 4 years of negotiations, we actually managed to have the agreement done. The one thing I would like to point is how easy it was to actually agree the agreement. So to say, I've linked Planartalk, a document that was agreed in February 2015 in Geneva, so-called Geneva negotiating text. It was 86 pages long, compared to what in Paris was like 12 pages.
Yeah, it's got a lot of...
Yes.
I was just going to say, it's got a lot of things in it. Probably not going to read through all of it, at least not right now. I'll probably... What's that?
Yeah, I don't think that anyone has read through this text. Negotiators usually just involve themselves in just parts of the agreement that are not interesting but pertain to their area of expertise, like adaptation, mitigation, and so on and so forth. Because climate agreement is quite a complicated issue. I will come back to this later, but there are a lot of different streams of negotiations that are there. After Paris, the negotiations did not stop because Paris was just a framework. After this, we needed a so-called rulebook that will implement and operationalize the things from Paris. This was actually agreed in 2018 in Katowice during COP24. That was a set of decisions operationalizing. However, last year in 2019, US again decided that despite the fact that they have ratified Paris, they will step down from the Paris Agreement and they will no longer be a party of it. And this will take place in 2020, about a year after presidential elections.
Okay. Yeah.
So
I just want to say, this is why I'm hoping that someone better than Donald Trump is elected this year, so that they can at least would they be able to? Here's just a quick question: would they be able to sign up or re-sign up to the Paris Agreement if there was a new president?
Yes, they will be, but this will take time because the next climate conference that will be in UK in November will be just a few days after they will be out of the Paris Agreement. So actually they will be there represented but not as a party to the Paris Agreement. And if new president takes office in January, they will be able to involve themselves really in negotiations only next year.
Okay. So isn't there a Paris meeting every 5 years, or is it every 1 year?
No. The meetings are every year. Usually it's either November or December. This year it's November 9th till I think 20th.
Okay. Oh wait, it's the because I do remember reading something where it said I think it's either 4 or 5 years, and remember, I think it's just a sort of check up to see how each country is doing or something.
Yes, it is called Global Stocktake. Global Stocktake takes place every 5 years, according to the Paris Agreement, and the first Global Stocktake will be in 2023. Additionally, every country every 4 years reports on its emissions and what they've done during those 4 years. That's called the national communication. However, also there might be some people who are wondering why the conferences take place in such exotic places like Cancun, Durban, Bali, or Katowice. This is quite simple because there are 5 United Nations groups, that's Western European and other groups, Eastern European group, Latin American and Caribbean group, Asia Pacific group, and African group. And each group calls the conference in turn. So COP21 was for the Western European group, that was Paris. COP22 was in Marrakesh in Africa. COP23 should be hosted in Asia, but it was actually in Bonn in Germany, but the presidency was done then by Fiji. COP24 was in Katowice in Poland, that was Eastern European group. And COP25, where it took place in Madrid, was presided by Chile, so it was for the Latin America and Caribbean group.
Okay.
Then how the negotiations really look like, because some people think that there are a lot of ministers, head of states coming into this room and discussing and preparing the agreement, which is far from how it really looks like. Usually the negotiating sessions like COP or subsidiary body sessions start with plenary that is launching the so-called contact groups, where every party might or but does not have to be represented, and the contact groups are set up for separate agenda points. So, for example, if you want to discuss finance, you have one or more contact group on finance. If you want to discuss adaptation, you have group on adaptation. The same goes for transparency, so the reporting, and so on and so forth. Then, when you have a contact group might start to launch an informal group that will be preparing the text of the decision that will be later taken in the plenary. Informal group, if it has a problem with reaching consensus for the decision, might again start discussing it in informal format. So smaller number of negotiators that try to get the deal done. And this might lead to even a smaller room where you have just 5 or 6 key negotiators that will be discussing certain things and then trying to convince others to accept what they have discussed. One important thing, under the convention there is no voting. All decisions taken under the convention, so in essence also under the Paris Agreement, have to be made by consensus. This was not a real rule because sometimes there were parties that were objecting to the decisions taken. For example, in Cancun it was Bolivia, in Doha it was Russia, Belarus and Ukraine. However, as a rule, all decisions have to be taken by the consensus.
Okay. So I just want to... one thing that I do want to ask is, because you're mentioning about that it's not done by consensus, or that it's not done by voting, but it's done by consensus. So what... Like, consensus to me does sound like a version of voting, but is there a... Like, what is the main difference between, apart from you're not pledging a vote, but consensus? Like, if just say 55 people have just say there's a consensus of 55 out of 100 negotiators that agree on something, do the other 45 people, are they overruled, or what goes on there?
As a rule, even if one party objects to the consensus, there is...
Oh, okay, so everybody has to be in on it, otherwise it doesn't go through.
As a rule.
Oh, okay.
And this is one of the problems with negotiations, because even if one party objects to the decision that should be taken, the decision cannot be taken. There are other problems, of course, and maybe we'll come to this when we'll start asking additional questions, but few problems with reaching the further agreements maybe are, for example, there is a huge investment requirement. the official funds that are existing right now under the convention, so Global Environmental Facility and Green Climate Fund, have about $3 billion per year. What is required is 100 billions, even not trillions, in investments globally. One of the problems with reaching certain things is political cycles in the democratic countries because, for example, how to convince your own people to, well, not even going climate neutral because that might be achieved, but to give money to other countries. That was something that was mentioned also in the cat lady's video about $100 billion. Also, there are other problems like discrepancies between what is in the official statements of several parties and their real position in negotiations. Usually also, although the positions of the countries in negotiations are more open than what is said officially. Well, some negotiators have their own ambitions and they're not really negotiating for their countries, but they are trying to, let's say, have their own agenda.
Yeah, so this would be certain politicians that may have stakes in... They might have stocks in a certain company that might profit...
No. It's not about politicians because in the negotiations, politicians are usually involved only in the last step when the decisions are actually made, or even not then. Usually it's done by the expert level, technical level negotiators. So they are sometimes doing their own, trying to achieve their own agenda, like getting a job in this or that fund, or something like that. So politicians usually are quite far from the real negotiations as they are done. They are usually present either in the beginning for the opening plenary or in the end during the final decisions. And that's it. And well...
Okay, so that actually makes a lot of sense as to why America might... that makes a lot of sense as to why America would be pulling out, because I'd think that, if, let's say, Donald Trump was a part of the negotiation process, then, he'd be able to basically say, no, we don't want that, and basically overall or stop things going ahead that he doesn't want, but instead he's pulling out, which makes sense if he doesn't have a lot of control over it. So yeah, that now makes a whole lot more sense.
Well, he has as much control as he wants it, but the negotiators are, because negotiators for the US, for example, from the most democratic countries are getting their mandate from their ministers, from their governments. However, in the other countries, where the negotiators are, for example, ambassadors, they have a lot of leeway to do what they want, because there is also one additional problem. I have sort of highlighted it before, but the negotiations are quite a complicated affair. You have a lot of different negotiation tracks there, which are quite technical and really not something that the usual politician can understand. Typical delegation from the country is like 10-15 people, each being an expert in different area. So I know just a bit about my part of negotiations. I have no technical expertise about several other areas that I'm not dealing with. And that's true for most of the negotiators. This became so fragmented that there is, I think, no single person that really can say, I understand everything that's said within negotiation.
Yeah, and that actually makes a lot of sense, because you'd have certain parts which focus, on maybe technologies that would be a good idea to try and invest into, or you might have certain parts that are more about ecological well-being in oceans, or you might have a certain part that's more about aerosols or something in the atmosphere.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So what was the next part that you wanted to talk about? Hold up.
I think I'm sort
I just want to note something, because you, as people already know, you're using a voice changer. And do you want to just say, explain why you're using a voice changer? This should have been explained at the start, but yeah.
Yeah, actually I'm doing this because I might be saying things that I should not say in public, and just to avoid having troubles in my personal life. I'm really using a voice changer, so that's not true.
Yeah. Which makes a lot of sense, Sometimes these kinds... I do know that there's all these things about NDAs, even if you're not in part of like a big thing like the UN, there'll be NDAs, even if you're a part of companies. I've had to sign NDAs before, and so yeah.
Exactly. I think that I'm done with the presentation right now. If there are any additional questions you'd like to ask, please do. I will try to answer them as well as possible. And then if we're done with that, we can go to the questions from chat. I would also like to answer the questions in the...
Okay. In that case, I'll turn the donations bar on. So any donations will be read out by the text to speech. So yeah, one of the things that you mentioned in our chat before is about the annexes. So you said a problem to the convention is annexes. Do you want to tell everyone what annexes are and why they're a problem?
Okay. So the convention has two annexes that were actually prepared in 1992 and essentially were not changed since then. There are Annex 1 and Annex 2 to the convention. Annex 2 lists countries that are obligated to provide financial support to developing countries. I will note that there is no real definition of the developing and developed country under the convention or under the Paris Agreement. And the Annex 2 is consisting of countries that in 1992 were part of the OECD, minus Turkey. Turkey was part of the Annex 2 but managed to be crossed out since then. Annex 1 are the parties that were obligated to decrease their emissions. Actually, those were the countries that were in either Annex 2 or the former communist countries from the Eastern Europe. So countries like Russia, Bulgaria, Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, and so on and so on.
Okay.
Bull.
Does anything meaningful actually reach consensus in these negotiations?
That is a very good question. And actually, it depends on your definition of anything meaningful. Because the negotiations are not negotiating the real emission reductions, at least right now. Paris Agreement is a bottom-up agreement where every country tries to assess how much it can reduce emissions, how much it can do, and this is something that should be done on the national level, not international level. Negotiations right now should have only a facilitated role, not pushing everyone to do emission reductions. Although we might see something like that in Glasgow, from what I know.
Okay. Yeah, because it is... I think one of the hard things with seeing consensus being reached, at least when it comes to this, is most people are used to seeing things like voting, where, especially in if you go to countries that which have millions of people, you're never going to get a consensus of voting. So even when it's just 100 people, it seems very hard to visualize a consensus being reached, especially meaningful consensus.
Yes, that is true. And essentially, to have a consensus on every decision is really, really hard, because by the consensus you can reach only as much as is outside of everyone's red lines. If you start crossing people's red lines, well, you will not reach the consensus. So everything that is not agreeable to to certain people, to certain countries, will be crossed out from the final decisions. So yeah.
Okay. Another thing you mentioned in our chats before was prisoner's paradox, and I can really understand this, especially with your whole annex thing, especially, and this is something that was kind of brought up by the cat lady, but not really explored. You know, the whole prisoner's paradox, and I've seen this with Australia. You know, Australia doesn't really want to reduce their emissions because they're only 2%. You know, and they think that places like China should reduce their emissions first. So, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, actually, that's something that is also a problem in the negotiations, that it's sort of a multilateral prisoner's paradox. So if one country decides to reduce its emissions too early, its economy might start being less competitive than of those of other countries. So this could lead to the economic downturn. At least that's the official version. But unless everyone reduces their emissions eventually, everyone will lose. But the first one to lose, of course, will be those that will reduce their emissions first, unless there will be some kind of game changer in the so.
Okay. So I'd actually say that it's not so much like a prisoner's paradox, but it's more a game of chicken.
Yes, a bit. However, if even if some of those people will chicken first, those that will not, those that will drive too far will eventually drive on.
Yeah, because it's like a game of chicken, but instead of being, if one person gets out, both people get out. It's more if both, if you've got two people driving towards each other and they've both got to hit the brakes, to otherwise, one of them will. I'm just trying to describe my analogy. So basically, if one person keeps going, then both of them are screwed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this leads to everyone having to reduce their emissions eventually, and reaching the climate neutrality by mid-century. Otherwise, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that I do wonder, though, is do you think that it might be feasible for some countries to work on technology that would help reduce emissions, and especially if this technology is profitable? Like, if just say there's a lot of research done into something that might... let's say that there's let's say that some country puts a lot of investment into some kind of renewable which was highly profitable. Do you think that that could be an option that some countries might take, or maybe some countries are already investing into, or?
Actually, I see two possible solutions to the main problem. The main problem is, for now at least, it's energy generation. One of the possible solutions would be thermonuclear power plants like ITER that is built in the European Union right now. The other possible solution would be using the power of the tides. That's, well, something that is a possibility, because tides are something that is actually predictable. But this is not something that will be commercial within the next few years, maybe later. But this is something that would give some countries an advantage, but just some, because not every country is sea-based, and not every country can use the tides to generate.
Yeah, like it would work well for a country like New Zealand, which has a lot of coastal areas and stuff, but it wouldn't work good for a country like, let's say, Germany, which is, if I remember my geography correctly, Germany is landlocked.
No, Germany is not landlocked.
It's not? Okay. This is where my geography is failing me. I can't remember the shape of all the Europe countries. I know that there's a couple of landlocked European countries.
Yeah, Switzerland, Austria, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary. Those are the...
Okay, yeah. I'm probably I haven't been to a geography class in ages, so yeah. So I'd make a good flirt in geography. But yeah, like New Zealand would do well, but it's countries that are landlocked or countries that have a lot of land-based areas where they'd have to transport power, because all power has to be transported to where it's going to be used, and infrastructure to transport power from like a coastal area inland. So just say you want to transport power from the sea to Utah in America, that's going to take a lot of infrastructure. So you'd want to. It would be much better to have some sort of other power source that's more close by. At least that's what I'm gathering from this.
Yeah, that's one of the problems. And for Germany, for example, it's even more of a problem because they don't have a direct power lines between their north and their south. So, for example, a lot of their power goes via...
In fact, this is a little bit of a thing in New Zealand, because we've got dams here in the South Island, and those dams, they actually supply most of the country with power, and I think they've built a whole lot of infrastructure to connect the North and the South Island, so the dams are actually supplying power to not only the South Island, but the North Island. So... although this only works because we're a small country. It wouldn't work if we're large like America.
Yeah, that's also a problem. There might be possible solutions if we would have room temperature superconductors, because in this case the power transfer would suddenly become something quite easy to achieve. And for example, for countries like US, Europe, or even Australia, power generations would start to be quite easy. You could have global solar farms that will create solar energy from every place in the world, and then it gets transferred anywhere with almost no loss of power. But this is also right outside.
Okay. Yeah. Because one one of the things is with the limits of technology. So, for example, you've got people that do say things like, "Oh, we should just have solar power and wind power, and just store all the excess power that we generate from this in batteries." But then batteries do have their own cost to the environment, and there are limitations to battery power.
This is a problem as well. Although I've seen an interesting solution for the energy storage actually, which is using large blocks of concrete. So I don't know if you know the type of energy storage where you pump water from lower level to the higher level when you have excess power, and then if you're lacking power, you just pump this water down and you generate power.
Okay. That might be interesting.
This is something that is already used.
Okay.
However, there is another possibility where you have a large blocks of concrete in sort of large towers. So you use some kind of elevators to raise those blocks of concrete when you have an excess power, and then you use them, then you let them fall down when you need power to generate energy like that. And this is, I think, something that is tried in Japan.
That would be... Because I haven't heard of that. I'd have to look into that. One of the things that the main thing that I've been hearing about lately is more of an alternative. It's more of an alternative to lithium batteries, which is solid state batteries. But I'm not sure entirely how solid state batteries work compared to lithium ion. I know that I'm pretty sure that lithium ion is just basically chemical reactions, and that's how it's stored, and that's how it gets power. Whereas solid state batteries, I need to look more into it. I know that Tesla's though is working with them, and that actually brings me to a question. Do you think that there's any sort of Thunderfoot already busted that concept? Okay, I'll need to look into it. I was gonna go into a question of, do you think that there's any, is there any action that's going to be taken that might impact companies through the Paris Agreement? So you got a lot of big corporations that are polluting, and obviously there's going to have to be some sort of action taken that will have to stop them. So what kind of action is going to be done to stop some of the major polluters?
The thing is that the Paris Agreement, as I said before, is country-based. So any legislation that will be taking place must be on the country level, not under the convention or under the Paris Agreement. So if you want to tackle any large polluters, you have to tackle them in individual countries. That's one of the problems of the climate negotiations, that if you want to tackle the polluter in the US, you have to do this in the US. If you want to tackle the polluter in China, you have to do.
Okay, so it's So the Paris Agreement doesn't dictate what should be done. It just so it's very hard to sort of say. Like, one of the hardest parts with working, I'm just trying to work out how I should say this. So one of the hardest parts with conceptualizing the Paris Agreement is when it's more of a guide, when it seems more like a guidelines of how things should be done rather than how things should be done.
Exactly. A lot of things that are under the Paris Agreement are just should be just internally done, not something that will be decided on the global level. Under the Paris Agreement, you create a document called National Determined Contribution, which shows how much you will try to reduce your emissions in a certain time period. However, how you do this and whether it's your best effort is up to individual countries, not the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement and the Convention will never force you to do this. And even if you will not be able to achieve what you have declared, there is no mechanism to actually enforce you to do anything more. This was actually implemented to have the US on board for the Paris Agreement. However, how did it work? Well,
yeah. Yeah, one person in the chat says, I have a question, but I'll have to remember what it was. One person in the chat says, it would be nice if there were a way to produce very effective artificial carbon sinks, and is there anything about that in the Paris Agreement, like artificial carbon sinks, or?
Actually, Paris Agreement does not have anything on technology, but there is an article on carbon sinks. I think it's Article 5, if I'm not mistaken, and it's mostly about growing forests. So it's not very artificial, it's more natural, and to be honest, forests are not enough to catch all the carbon dioxide that is produced. There is a potential technology called carbon capture and storage that is still in experimental phase that would allow, for example, even coal power plants to exist if the CO2 could be captured and stored underground. But this is a very uncertain technology, and for now it's very...
Okay. Yeah. So I was just going to bring up this thing here. That's it's from Climate. This is relating to the point that was brought up earlier with the whole countries having to take their own course of action. So this is the climateactiontracker.org, and it shows every country, and you've got no country that's in the green, right? All countries are, you've got Morocco and the Gambia that are less than, or that are 1.5 degrees agreement compatible, but you've got none in the role model section. All of them are 2 degrees, all of them except for Morocco and the Gambia are 2 degrees compatible. You've got insufficient, which is 3 degrees. You got highly insufficient, which is 4 degrees, and then you've got critically insufficient, which is more than 4 degrees. So you've got countries like USA, which is 4 degrees, and you've also got places like the Russian Federation, Turkey, Ukraine, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia. They're all there. And in highly insufficient, you've got countries like China, Japan, Indonesia, South Africa, all that kind of stuff. So this also plays into the whole chicken thing, because someone were to look at this and say, well, you could have Canada, for example, say, well, USA isn't doing their part, so why should we do our part, kind of thing. And this seems to be a sort of issue, a little bit of an issue with countries sort of dictating what they do themselves.
Yeah, that's one of the problems. However, I don't know how it will change during this year, because, as you know, several countries and will declare their carbon neutrality by mid-century. For example, EU will be carbon neutral by 2050, at least that's what is declared right now. We shall see how the path will develop. also, several other countries are starting to declare the carbon neutrality. I know that Chile, before it became the COP25 presidency, also aimed at carbon neutrality by mid-century. However, with their internal problems, economical problems, I don't know whether they will be able to deliver. We shall see. Uh, and also, as you can see, there is a large number of countries that are not actually tracked. So mostly Africa, but also some South American and Asian countries. And one of the problems that might be there is actually not about the power plants, because if you want to reduce emissions by 30, 40, 50%, you have to look at the power plants, you have to look at the industry. But at a certain point, one of the problems that will start to become more and more important is about the transport system and about the agriculture. So, for example, whether you can have those cows, sheep, or pigs in your country, whether you are able to really have meat or not. And also, you have to remember that, for example, cows produce a lot of methane. That is a very hard greenhouse.
Yeah, very potent greenhouse gas. Yeah. One thing that I was, that does bring me to an interesting point, because I do know that in New Zealand we are trying to refine our transport system, especially in places like Auckland, where there is a lot of congestion in the. Basically, it takes 2 hours to get to work each day in Auckland, and it's whereas in any other city it would only take probably 15 minutes to half an hour to get there, and having traffic that is congested can be a big problem, especially seeing as some people would some people will be sitting in traffic for ages using petrol that isn't really being put to any use. And so, that is a big problem. But then again, there's also the agricultural industry in New Zealand, which is... I'm not sure how New Zealand's going to deal with that. So...
Yeah, that's a problem not just for New Zealand, but for almost every country in the world. Because at one point you will have to find a way to grow enough food for your population, which will not impact climate. And the only way at a certain point might be that you will have to find really a way to get the carbon from the atmosphere into some kind of sink, but we don't have it often.
Yeah. There is one of the things I've been reading about with carbon neutral, because you got carbon zero, zero carbon, which has zero carbon emissions, but then you've also got carbon neutral, which means that if there's emissions that are being emitted, then basically you have some way of bringing them back and basically stop them from... basically, the carbon that you put out, you also take in, sort of thing. One person in the chat did say there's no fucking way India is a closer country to being carbon neutral country than New Zealand. Delhi is like the most polluted city in the world. India must be honest be the least honest when it comes to emissions. Do you have anything to say about that, or?
Actually, those countries that are closest to being the carbon neutral might be the Nordic countries in Europe, so like Finland, Sweden, maybe Norway, but I'm not sure about it with their oil production. But yeah, countries in Northern Europe like Finland or Sweden have a large forest area, so they actually are able to get some CO2 from atmosphere to offset their emissions, and they can become carbon neutral by, let's say, 2035.
Okay. So a lot of this would be... So, yeah, this wouldn't be so much looking at individual cities. Like, Delhi, yes, may be a very... Delhi may be a very polluted city itself, but if you look at the country as a whole, then you'd get it paints a different picture. And there's... I thought you were going to say something for a second.
No, I wanted to agree with you that, yes, you have to look at the country or even the world as a whole.
Yeah.
One of the misconceptions is that, for example, the Amazon and the rainforest are creating most of these oxygen on the planet, where actually it's mostly from the oceans.
Yeah. I do know that one of the big things that has been a problem is with killing of things like whales, which produce a lot of which have in their poo they've got a whole lot of iron, which helps algae bloom. So yeah, that's that's a fun fact. But with whale populations declining, that could be a big problem, at least from what I've heard.
Yeah, that's a possibility. But we have to look on the planet as a whole, not just individual parts, because in the end, it's the planet as a whole that will suffer, not individual countries. That's something that goes beyond the possibilities of individual.
Yeah. Like...
And also I see a comment in the chat about China underreporting about their emissions. While it might be true, there are ways to see how much they are emitting via indirect sources. So you can see how much coal, oil, natural gas they're importing, and try to assess how much their emission really is. And that's something that, for example, International Energy Agency.
Okay, so that would be that's a good question. So, what are ways that we keep track of these kinds of things? So you've said about keeping track of importing things from China. So what are ways that we keep track of just general emissions around the globe, and how much is produced by humans compared to what is produced sort of naturally by other forms? And is there any overlap as well?
Well, that's one of the things that some of climate deniers is using, that what humans produce is much less than, for example, what volcanoes produce. But I was curious whether it is the case or not, so I ran the numbers. Of course, the flares will say, well, you cannot do the numbers because we are under the dome. However, I tried to assess the volume of the atmosphere, how much of the CO2 is produced based on the best available data, and numbers check. So most of the CO2 increase in the atmosphere we have right now comes from the anthropogenic sources, from our industry, from our power plants, not from the volcanoes and such. It might be true that 20 or 30 years ago volcanoes were a massive problem, but it's no longer.
Okay. I do just want to put it to chat to see if they've got any questions. I think I've gone through most of the questions that I've had. And this has been a very, very interesting discussion. Thank you for coming on, by the way.
No problem. Thank you for having me. Yeah. And sorry for the quality.
Yeah, I've mostly understood what you're saying. Some of the bigger words have gotten lost, but for the general message I've understood. If anyone is confused about what you've been saying, then a good way would probably be to watch this on maybe 0.75%. This will probably be one of my shorter live streams because it's hard to come up with questions on something like this, especially when the Paris Agreement isn't so much based on policy, but when this is more based, when the Paris Agreement isn't so much based on individual policy, but mostly based on guidelines which are supposed to direct individual policy in a way, but it's more down to the countries, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. It's mostly up to the countries what they will do and what they will implement, what they will what they will say they will do. Also, one thing about the national determined contributions, because I've said that we'll have this climate conference in UK later this year. But also this year, one thing that should be done is the new set of nationally determined contributions. So, sort of increase of ambitions of countries. We shall see how it goes. Theoretically, the deadline for submitting those submissions was, I think, 2 or 3 days ago, but so far no new submissions. But I know that some countries, some group of parties will have submissions before the end of the year, so we might not be screwed up.
There's actually a question. There's actually a question here by Zero. Are potential agreements inhibited by representative governments since they can't really make strong, legally binding agreements?
First of all, I would have to ask what you do mean by agreement, because first of all, there are legally binding agreements. Reaching a legally binding global agreement is a hard issue. For Paris Agreement, we have negotiated for 4 years. It took, I think that's like 4 or 5 months of total negotiation time to reach the Paris Agreement. And it was not an easy thing, and it still lacks in certain ambition areas, as you can see, obviously. However, this is something I had thought of like a joke, that some people might try to have a conspiracy theory about it. So if anyone asks you about this conspiracy theory in the future, maybe it was the first place where it popped out, that now we have a climate emergency, but we won't be able to reach it as individual states, so maybe some Illuminati will try to push for a global government that will be able to reach a global climate. Yeah, but seriously, yes, certain countries are not able to agree on individual commitments. Mostly this is US, but not just US. There are other countries that value their sovereignty very much, and they will not allow the international agreements to push into their individual sovereignty, and this is...
You cut out there. I'm not sure. Is it? Are you there?
Are you there?
You cut out for a bit.
Oh, sorry. I don't know where did I cut out, but first of all, certain representative governments can't really make strong legal binding agreements because of their own laws that do not allow them to give their sovereignty to any outside organization or agenda. I've told about this potential conspiracy theory. So
yeah. I think you cut out again.
Oh no! I've just turned off the mic. So yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I see.
Okay, well, I'll see. I'll give like 2 more minutes for everyone if they want to ask any question. So, I do have to say, I do have to ask you one thing though about, because I do find that there's different types of stances when it comes to climate. There's you've got climate deniers, you've got climate alarmists, you've got climate defeatists, and then you've got climate hopefulists, I guess. And the difference between these is climate deniers deny that anthropogenic global warming or anthropogenic carbon emissions are having a significant impact on the climate. They just deny that. There's the climate alarmists basically say, yeah, the world's ending soon unless we do something about it now. Climate defeatists basically go, yeah, the world's ending and there's nothing we can do about it. And climate hopefulists basically say, well, there's still time to do something about it. We've just got to make sure that everyone's on board, but they don't try and make any claims like the world's ending or anything like that. They just try and, I suppose the climate hopefulists are trying to speak to the mostly to the climate deniers, trying to say, hey, look, let's try and do something, I guess. So which one of those categories do you think you'd fit into?
I think I would be sort of climate hopeful. We still can do something. And also, as for the climate, those hopeless people that think that the world's going to end and we can do anything about it. I don't think that life on Earth will end because of the climate change. I don't even think that the human race will end as a result of climate change, even if we will not do anything. It's just our civilization, as we know it at least right now. But we still can do a lot about it, but we just have.
Okay. One person asks, are we way more fucked than we are told?
Well, I think that I will try to refrain from answering that until the end of the year. Also, to see how the weather during this year will progress, because where I live, it's the first year where we had almost no snow in winter. First I remember. So that's something that's really disconcerting to me. But last year we had several heat waves that were longer and more unusual than we had in the previous years. And this was the first year I remember where I could walk in October in a t-shirt outside. So I will see how it will go this year, but it will not be that hard this year. That maybe we'll still.
You know, I feel like I'd like to just swap my weather with yours, because I've been having pretty bad weather lately, and it's supposed to be summer, right? And it's just been raining. But Joey D asks, how effective do you believe that carbon credits are as a tool to fight climate change?
First of all, there is no carbon credits right now as such. Of course, European Union has something called the emission trading scheme, but this is just for the European Union. Otherwise, there is no really market for the carbon credits. Whether it can work in the future, it's hard to determine, because it depends on what the base for the carbon credits would be. And there is still decision on the carbon credits under the Convention and under the Paris Agreement that will have to be made. In Katowice in 2018, the decision was not taken. It failed in Madrid last year, and this will be one of the main points of the conference this year in Glasgow. So, and I don't know if the decision will be made. I think it would be effective only if you have a global carbon budget and trade between those global carbon budgets. But otherwise,
Bill Biggins said thanks. It was a good, honest answer, at least as far as he could decipher it. Okay. Anyway, I'm just going to say last chance to ask questions, and then I'm going to end the stream. Just while I'm waiting to see if there's any more questions, there's one thing that I want to just say to everyone, because I know that a few of my audience members are probably over in the US where it's Valentine's Day. So happy Valentine's Day to everyone that's currently not in Valentine's Day. So that excludes the New Zealanders and the Australians, because we're a bit ahead of the world. And Dime Till Death says, where on earth do you live? New Zealand is in a serious drought. Literally been the sunniest summer in Auckland. Hasn't rained since December 25th. And you see, that's the thing. You're in Auckland. I'm far down south where it's just been... it wasn't raining yesterday, I don't remember. I don't think it was raining yesterday. But a couple of days ago it was raining. It wasn't like... It wasn't hard. It wasn't really a whole lot of rain, but it was definitely enough to be like, oh, jeez, will we ever get sunny? But today looks sunny, which is good. I'm going to be going out a bit today, so hopefully today is a lot better. Hopefully the weather doesn't change, although clouds on the horizon don't look a whole lot good. Bill Baggins says, pity about the voice issue, an important topic. And Joey D asks, is your brain still working after having a discussion with Slick the other day? Yes, it is. Dime Till Death says, don't tell me you're an Invercargill. Well, the thing is, I try not to tell anyone where I live. It is fairly easy to work out where I live. All you have to do is just put the pieces of the puzzle together. So it's pretty obvious where I live, because there are people that know where I live that have said on things like Twitter or even on YouTube, and some of the comments have said, oh, you live in yada yada place. So I don't think that there's any more questions. So once again, thank you for coming on. Been a good discussion.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and yes, I think it was a good discussion.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, what was that? You cut out. You said sorry, and then...
Oh, sorry again for the voice.
Okay, yeah. It's understandable about the voice. You know, you don't want to say something that could be an issue, and then you got to face real life consequences for it. I just noticed Joey D said, "Are you sure, or do you just believe you're okay?" Okay, yeah, I'm sure. Anyway, so yeah, that was a pretty good discussion. Definitely, I think I know a bit more about the Paris Agreement, so that's always good. I'll probably have to go ahead and read the full documents, although I've still got to do that for Agenda 21. Do you know? Are you involved in Agenda 21 or Agenda 2030 at all, or no?
No, I'm mostly in the climate issues, so anything that goes beyond the UNFCCC, so the climate convention, is mostly beyond my scope. But of course, some things that goes into, for example, like sustainable development goals are still things that will come up.
Okay. Yeah. Because that's something that I need to look into, but it's a 200 page... I think it's 300 page document or something. A lot of... there's a lot to unpack there, so I'll have to sit down one day and just read the whole thing and try and somehow make it entertaining. Might be able to make a video on it. But anyway, leave a like and subscribe if you liked this stream. Leave a comment leave a comment what you think, and let me know what kind of streams you'd like me to do in the future. One person did say that I should interview someone from India. I can't remember. Professor Phil Bell from who is doing work in India. And so, I might try and see if I can reach out to that person. It's always good to be able to reach out to people and see what's being done. And I think these topics are far more important than things like Flat Earth, even if they're slightly less entertaining, because, Flat Earth, it's just a conspiracy theory which, most people will see, it's a silly conspiracy theory. Whereas climate change, people will look at it and go, and they'll believe the conspiracy without thinking that it might be a conspiracy theory or something like that. So yeah, these things are far more important than Flat Earth, but not quite as entertaining, unfortunately. So anyway, I will see you in the next stream. Between you and me, thank you for watching. Let's do some sultans.